I stand here today
on an island in the middle of the mighty Mississippi,
clear-eyed about the fight ahead.
to declare
these words.
that
I am a candidate for president.
I'm running for president of the United States of America.
President of the United States.
Testing 1, 2, 3. Hi everyone, and welcome to another Woke Wednesday. This podcast was created to shed light on different societal issues which have been at the forefront of public discourse through one of the most divisive times in American history. More so, it was created with the intent of allowing those who have often been neglected, shunned, or misunderstood to have a chance to share their experiences and thoughts. I hope that this dialogue encourages critical conversation and activism amongst all listeners, and I hope you'll tell all your friends about it and share it on your social platforms. For the next few weeks, we are going to begin a series that focuses specifically on the 2020 presidential candidates. Each episode will detail the candidate's personal and political life, all with the hope of helping to inform our listeners and beyond on each of the candidates. By promoting insight into each of these people, our hope is that each voter is able to make educated, well-informed decisions on who they'll cast their ballot for in the next presidential election. I also want to encourage you to seek out other outlets like mine to have a wider grasp on who these individuals are and what they bring to the table for you and your loved ones. Because we all know that everyone has implicit biases, myself included. Each episode will, of course, highlight our own personal thoughts concerning the candidates, what the country needs moving forward, and how this person could potentially impact our society holistically. Lastly, I want to point out to you that we've chosen to highlight each candidate in alphabetical order, instead of choosing who may or may not be a favorite of our own, in order to remain conscious of how our own implicit bias can affect how the episodes are previewed. We also want to point out that while every presidential candidate we're running has different noteworthy platforms, we're only covering candidates with a somewhat plausible chance of winning the candidacy. Moreover, we also recognize that there are a multitude of candidates running for the position, which makes it impossible to allocate an episode to every candidate there is. If there is any candidate that you all feel strongly about that we don't make it to, please let us know by engaging with us on Facebook and Instagram. We love hearing feedback from all of our listeners. And lastly, we are starting a special vlog series via social media to update our listeners on those current issue events that are most pertinent to you and to us. To be informed on when the vlogging will be posted, please follow along on Facebook or our Instagram at Have a Woke Wednesday. With that, on this episode, we're featuring Massachusetts Senior Senator Elizabeth Warren.
In our country, if you work hard and play by the rules, you ought to be able to take care of yourself and the people you love. That's a fundamental promise of America. A promise that should be true for everyone. Growing up in Oklahoma, that promise came through for me and my family. After my older brothers joined the military and I was still just a kid, my daddy had a heart attack and couldn't work. My mom found a minimum wage job at Sears, and that job saved our house and our family. My daddy ended up as a janitor, but he raised a daughter who got to be a public school teacher, a law professor, and a senator. We got a real opportunity to build something. Working families today face a lot tougher path than my family did. And families of color face a path that is steeper and rockier, a path made even harder by the impact of generations of discrimination. I've spent my career getting to the bottom of why America's promise works for some families, but others who work just as hard slip through the cracks into disaster. And what I've found is terrifying. These aren't cracks that families are falling into, they're traps. America's middle class is under attack. How did we get here? Billionaires and big corporations decided they wanted more of the pie, and they enlisted politicians to cut them a fatter slice. They crippled unions so no one could stop them.
We're going to turn the bull loose.
Dismantled the financial rules meant to keep us safe after the Great Depression, and cut their own taxes so they paid less than their secretaries and janitors.
It's time to write the rules for the middle class.
After Wall Street crashed our economy in 2008, I left the classroom to go to Washington and confront the broken system head on.
Elizabeth Warren, apparently not afraid to tangle with Wall Street.
Elizabeth Warren is heading into the lion's den.
Mrs. Warren goes to Washington.
She did.
We created America's first consumer watchdog to hold the big banks accountable.
A woman who has warned of another meltdown if Washington doesn't straighten up.
I never thought I'd run for office, not in a million years. But when Republican senators tried to sabotage the reforms and run me out of town, I went back to Massachusetts and ran against one of them. And I beat him.
And we are going to turn Washington back to the people.
Who do we love? Warren! Who do we love? Warren!
Today, corruption is poisoning our democracy. Politicians look the other way while big insurance companies deny patients life-saving coverage, while big banks rip off consumers, and while big oil companies destroy this planet. Our government's supposed to work for all of us, but instead, it has become a tool for the wealthy and well-connected. The whole scam is propped up by an echo chamber of fear and hate, designed to distract and divide us. People who will do or say anything to hang on to power point the finger at anyone who looks, thinks, prays, or loves differently than they do.
Build that wall.
But this dark path doesn't have to be our future. We can make our democracy work for all of us. We can make our economy work for all of us. We can rebuild America's middle class, but this time we gotta build it for everyone. No matter where you live in America, and no matter where your family came from in the world, you deserve a path to opportunity. Because no matter what our differences, most of us want the same thing: to be able to work hard, play by the same set of rules, and take care of the people we love. That's the America I'm fighting for. And that's why today I'm launching an exploratory committee for president. But the outcome of this election will depend on you. In the last 2 years, millions of people have done more than they ever thought they would to protect the promise of America. And here's what we learned. If we organize together, if we fight together, if we persist together, we can win. We can, and we will.
Warren was born and raised in Oklahoma as the youngest and only daughter to two parents. She spent most of her childhood in what she describes as the ragged edge of the middle class. Her father worked as a maintenance man, and her mother did catalog work at Sears when her father suffered a heart attack that created huge medical bills. Warren herself began helping out by waiting tables at the age of 13 at her aunt's Mexican restaurant. While the family's efforts to relieve themselves of the financial burdens were valiant, the pressure still remained, and money was still tight. Warren even recalled one instance in which her mother was hesitant to take her to the doctor when she was a child because of a lack of finances. Unsurprisingly, Warren excelled at academics. In high school, she was the star of the debate team by becoming state debate champion, and she graduated high school at the age of 16. She was awarded a full debate scholarship to George Washington University. She intended to become a public school teacher, but after 2 years of studies, she dropped out to marry her high school sweetheart, Jim Warren, a NASA mathematician. They moved to Texas, where she completed her speech pathology and audiology degree at the University of Houston, becoming the first in her immediate family to earn the degree. Okay, sis, I see you. Following her degree from Houston, the couple then moved to New Jersey for her husband's job. During this time, Warren gave birth to 2 children, Alex and Amelia, and worked as a speech pathologist. After Amelia turned 2, Warren enrolled in Rutgers Law School. Following this, she and her husband divorced, and she returned to Rutgers, but this time as a lecturer. In the year following her divorce, she really began exploring the economic pressures of the American middle class by specifically looking at a 1978 law passed by Congress that made it easier for companies and individuals to declare bankruptcy. She discovered that a lot of middle-class families were filing for bankruptcy because of having lost jobs, experiencing financial hardship from either divorce or unexpected medical expenses. Her findings led her to her expertise and interest in commercial law and bankruptcy, and how they specifically affect the working class, women, financially distressed companies, and elderly people. And we'll get into that a little further as we discuss her career as a professor and now a politician. She remained there for a year before moving back to Texas to take a job at the UH Law Center as an assistant and then associate law professor. After leaving UH, she moved to the University of Texas at Austin to become a professor of law. She stayed there for 4 years and slowly became a rising star in her field. From Texas, she switched to become a professor of law at the University of Pennsylvania School of Law in 1987. In 1990, she became the William A. Schneider Professor of Law. Interestingly enough, one thing that Warren doesn't always mention in regards to this particular time is her past as a Republican. A die-hard conservative, one of her friends told Politico, and surprisingly, sometimes anti-consumer. Warren actually wrote an influential paper on utilities regulation that basically ignored the consumer issues which she is now such a strong advocate for. She also didn't register as a Democrat until 1996, which is around her late 40s. Some point out that she isn't apt to talking about her progression because she doesn't want to look inconsistent to the voters. Her conservatism also didn't center around social issues like abortion or gay rights, according to her friends. But it focused mainly on economic policy, where, as we can see now, is the driving force behind her presidential campaign and her academic career. Warren herself states that her academic work at the time focused mostly on what was dominating the economic system, which was an emphasis on the efficiency of free markets and unrestrained businesses. She claims that while she didn't necessarily hold those strong conservative beliefs, but did acknowledge that she went through a profound change when she began transforming how she viewed public policy and was very disillusioned by the process. Another criticism of her comes from a report in 1986 that states she listed herself as American Indian on a registration card for the State Bar of Texas. A Washington Post reporter tweeted out the original copy of the registration card, and sure enough, Warren had filled it out and listed American Indian under the slot for race. Warren claims that as a young child, she had always been told by older family members that they had Native American ancestry. But this wasn't the first or second or even third time that she has been criticized for attempting to claim Native ancestry. In 2012, her ethnicity was also listed under Native American at the University of Pennsylvania. And while I've personally been an advocate for her and I actually got to meet her, I'd clearly be showing bias and ignorance by not addressing her careless and oblivious, literally to say the least, choices in claiming ancestry to a marginalized group despite having no documented ancestors of Cherokee descent and doing it in a sort of way that proves people wrong is disheartening and offensive to say the least. While this incident started in the 80s, it's trickled into the mid-2000s, which I'm sure you all have heard about and we'll discuss later. Going back to her professor days, after leaving UPenn, she taught for a year as a Robert Brocker visiting professor of commercial law at Harvard. She left Harvard, but then returned 3 years later as a full-time professor, making her the first in Harvard's history to be a tenured professor that had gotten a degree from an American public university. Along the way on her journey, she married Harvard legal scholar Bruce Mann, and they've been together ever since and have such a cute dog. Like I mentioned before, she became an expert in the fields of commercial and bankruptcy law and was quoted among her peers in the field as the best of the best. Because of it, in 1995, she was asked to advise the National Bankruptcy Review Commission. During this time, she testified against congressional efforts to limit consumers' efforts to file bankruptcy. Despite her advocacy, she lost, and the bill was passed in 2005. She also was the first academic member of the Federal Judicial Education Committee. She wrote many scholarly articles and even published several books, two of which are co-authored with her daughter, entitled The Two-Income Trap: Why Middle-Class Mothers and Fathers Are Going Broke, and All You're Worth: The Ultimate Lifetime Plan. In 2008, she was appointed by Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid to serve as the chair of the Congressional Oversight Panel. This monitored the $700 billion bank bailout effort, otherwise known as the Troubled Asset Relief Program. She headed investigations, conducted televised public hearings, led interviews of government officials, and submitted monthly reports demanding accountability from the banks. For her efforts, the Boston Globe named Warren Bostonian of the Year in 2009. She stepped down 2 years later after being appointed by Barack Obama as assistant to the president and special advisor to the Secretary of the Treasury on the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. In her role, she helped design the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau as part of the Dodd-Frank financial reform legislation. The main goal of the Bureau was to police credit lenders and prevent consumers from unknowingly signing up for risky loans. Because of a large Republican opposition and some Democratic opposition, she was not chosen to head the agency and stepped down as a special advisor in 2011. Y'all, sis was booked and busy, period. She was doing so much.
I'm over here very booked and busy while you bitches over here are still looking raggedy and not doing shit. Wow.
After her time as advisor to Obama, Warren announced her candidacy for the U.S. Senate seat in Massachusetts, which put her up against Republican incumbent Scott Brown. During this time, a speech went viral of her appealing to populist supporters by arguing against the idea that taxing the wealthy is class warfare. During the race, her Republican opponent led her majority of the time. Yet, after she appeared at the National Democratic Convention, she gained national exposure and won more supporters and even some critics. There, she discussed the needs for economic and government reforms. Warren ended up winning the Senate seat to become the first woman ever elected to the Senate from Massachusetts. During her first term, she was assigned to the Senate Banking Committee, obviously. She introduced her first bill, the Bank on Student Loans Fairness Act, which proposed that students should receive the same interest rates on their federal loans as banks do on theirs. She also earned seats on the Committee on Health, Education, Labor and Pensions, and the Special Committee on Aging. Her memoir, A Fighting Chance, was published in 2014. Alongside John McCain, Maria Cantwell, and Agnes King, they introduced the 21st Century Glass-Steagall Act, a piece of legislation that was built on the Banking Act of 1993. The legislation was intended to reduce American taxpayers' risk of future financial crises. She made headlines again after questioning of Wells Fargo CEO John Stump, who was in the midst of one of the biggest financial scandals in history, in which Wells Fargo has opened more than 2 million bank and credit card accounts for customers that never asked for them. Y'all need to cut them off, period, because they were scamming. She continuously held him accountable in the hearing by asking him why he hadn't resigned, why he hasn't fired any of the senior executives, or why he hasn't given any of the money back that his company stole from people. Although he claimed that he was the one that was accountable for this. Her being able to question one of the most powerful bankers in the country so pointedly is another indicator of her ability to reveal the economic injustices that constantly happen in our country at the hands of the wealthy and powerful. And her questioning didn't just stop with him. After the 2016 presidential race and Trump was announced president, Warren questioned several cabinet members of Trump's administration in their confirmation hearings. She also criticized some of Trump's immediate policy implementations, such as the travel ban of people from predominantly Muslim countries and pulling troops from Syria and Afghanistan, because this should be done so in a well thought out, timely plan. She vehemently opposed the confirmation of Jeff Sessions as Attorney General and even read a letter from Coretta Scott King that stated that Sessions was too racist to be a federal judge during that time period. Because he was. Anyways, Republican leader Mitch McConnell kept interrupting her, claiming she was violating provisions of the Senate rules. So, Warren went in the hallway and read the letter out loud via Facebook video, and it was viewed more than 7 million times. Leading up to the 2016 presidential election, many speculated that she'd run for president, and she denied it multiple times. She took to the campaign trail with Clinton and endorsed her as a 2016 presidential candidate. Following Clinton's loss to Trump, Warren promised that she wouldn't let the bigoted policies of Trump win and announced a second term for Senate. She won in the 2018 midterm elections. Following this, she formed an exploratory committee to run for president and officially announced in February of this year. Now, in regards to her Native American ancestry that was started in the late 80s, it trickled out again after she released a DNA test that showed strong evidence that she had Native American ancestry going back 6 to 10 generations. After being challenged repeatedly by Trump and others to prove her lineage and being mocked and called Pocahontas by him, she revealed the test, which of course sparked outrage and disdain.
I am not a tribal citizen. I had a good conversation last week with Chief Baker, who is chief of the Cherokee tribes, and I told Chief Baker that I am sorry that I extended confusion about tribal citizenship and tribal sovereignty and for harm caused. I am also sorry for not being more mindful of this decades ago. Tribes and only tribes determine tribal citizenship. I had a good conversation with Chief Baker. He was very gracious, and we continue to talk about issues and continue to work on issues that matter deeply to Indian country and continue to work on things that we both care a lot about. Nothing about my background ever had anything to do with any job I got in any place. It's been fully documented and there's no evidence. This was about 30 years ago, and I am not a tribal citizen. Tribes and only tribes determine citizenship. When I was growing up in Oklahoma, I learned about my family the same way most people do. My brothers and I learned from our mom and our dad and our brothers and our sisters, and those were our family stories. But that said, there really is an important distinction of tribal citizenship. I am not a member of a tribe, and I have apologized for not being more sensitive to that distinction. It's an important distinction.
The Cherokee Nation stated that genetics don't prove tribalship, and that using a DNA test to claim connection to any Cherokee Nation or any tribal nation is inappropriate and severely misguided, which I agree with. Laying claim to any group that one doesn't actually belong to is insulting, to say the least. And while Warren has repeatedly apologized for it and has not been proven guilty of claiming minority status in hopes of getting preferential treatment, which is what we should be given in the first place, but it was taken from it anyways, we're not going to go there. It goes without saying that she definitely should have known better by not only not releasing these results, but having the willingness to go so far, so constantly, to claim their heritage with no sufficient proof or even background knowledge. Now, as a 2020 Democratic nominee, Warren has taken to the campaign trails with her signature line, "I have a plan for that," coupled with her ability to be anecdotal and relatable, has truly pushed her ahead in the polls and in terms of fundraising. She's reportedly raised $19.1 million thus far, all through a grassroots-funded campaign in which she has refused to take private donor parties and super PAC contributions, because she truly believes in breaking down the hold that the wealthy and powerful have on Washington politicians. She also identifies herself as a Democratic capitalist, unlike Bernie Sanders, who identifies himself as a Democratic socialist, which a lot of people like to compare the two, which, yes, their policies are somewhat similar in a lot of regards, but they're two very different candidates, and honestly, women shouldn't be compared to men. I'm just saying. Her policies of this race have been nothing short of progressive and advocating for those often left powerless due to financial constraints, race, gender, or other factors. She wants to enforce a wealth tax on the wealthiest of the wealthy by implementing a 2% tax on wealth exceeding $50 million and a 3% tax on wealth exceeding $1 billion. Her tax would eliminate the $640 billion in student debt, all while paying for universal free college tuition. She's co-sponsored Bernie Sanders' Medicare for All bill, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's Green New Deal, and Cory Booker's federal legislation of legalizing weed bill. She wants to break up big tech corporations such as Amazon, Facebook, and Google by prohibiting companies with over $25 billion in revenue by acting as operators and users of a platform and installing regulators to break up already closed mergers. She also has proposed that 40% of corporate boards like these be comprised of workers in order to allow them to have a seat at the table because they need it, and prevent executives from enforcing harmful policies that most affect their workers. She supports abolishing the Electoral College, banning private prisons, protecting reproductive rights, and proposed a $100 billion plan to fund first responders, public health departments, and states for prevention and rehabilitation services in order to combat the opioid crisis. She also wants to require that the Pentagon reach net zero carbon emissions on non-combat bases by 2030, and has been actively in support of funding initiatives that aim to combat climate change because it's real. She's also been actively involved in the fight for minority rights in this race. She's promised investing $50 billion in HBCUs, providing universal child care, and her concrete plans in addressing housing discrimination and addressing the higher than average maternal mortality rate amongst Black women. These two particular plans wooed the crowd when she introduced them at the She the People Presidential Forum, which was the first forum ever for women of color. She wants to decriminalize unauthorized border crossings and has been heavily critical of the internment-like camps that are currently happening at the border that have been authorized by the Trump administration. While I ultimately have very strong feelings towards Warren and am so grateful for the opportunity not only to have attended her town hall, but to actually meet her, one thing that's truly stood out to me in regards to her is her willingness to talk to people and her relatability. I mean, y'all, she literally has stayed after every town hall until everyone has gotten a picture with her or the chance to talk to her, even if it's hours later. I think a few weeks ago, she had reported that she had taken her 35,000th selfie. What? I literally stayed in line for an hour and a half, and even after waiting that long, she was upbeat and so kind. Her policies have also struck me because they've centered around the most vulnerable in our country and ensures that human dignity and compassion will be the focal points in implementing and creating policies that benefit all and not just some. While she's had some very questionable choices in her past, it will be most exciting to see how far she pans out in the race because she's constantly gaining momentum in the polls and has been actively seen on social media meeting with different activists and organizers, and then going out and creating people-inspired plans. I hope that this episode was informative and thought-provoking for all that listen and for those that will listen in the future. I hope that Warren's economic and social justice platforms encourages all voters to use their voice and select the candidate that is beneficial to all social classes and not just the ones at the top. I also hope that certain identifying factors that she has doesn't exclude her from people's decisions when deciding on who they'll select as our next president. Choosing the best person regardless of such things for our democracy is what we as voters should be doing. Remember, all of these opinions are my own, but they should be everyone else's. Have a woke Wednesday. Thank you for another Woke Wednesday. Transcripts of entire episodes will be available on the Woke Wednesday website. Episodes are written and produced by Hannah Mason and Trey Leonard of Lenico Entertainment. Episodes are hosted by Hannah Mason and edited by Trey Leonard. All graphics are designed by Anna French.